Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today's book talk hosted by the Center for Comparative and Public Law of the Hong Kong U Law Faculty. I'm Han Zhu. I'm a research assistant professor at the Hong Kong U Law Faculty, and I'll be chairing this event. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Lee Water from Hong Kong Metropolitan University to give us a talk on his newly published book. The book just came out this year. It's entitled Principles and Laws in World Politics, Classical Chinese Perspectives on Global Conflict. I've taken a quick browse through the book, and I think it's really a very timely topic given what is going on in the world today that concerns all of us. Now we have the COVID-19, the ongoing Ukraine war, the deteriorating relation between China and the West, and also the rising concerns over a new Cold War. And very unfortunately, just 2 days ago, there was a terrorist attack on a Confucius Institute in Pakistan. So I think this book and this talk would shed light on all these critical issues we are facing nowadays. Firstly, let me briefly introduce the author of the book and our distinguished discussant here. Our author here, Dr. Lee, is assistant professor at the School of Arts and Social Sciences, also program leader of Global and China Studies and research fellow of Public and Social Policy Research Center at Hong Kong Metropolitan University. He specializes in Chinese international relations, particularly the competition and the cooperation that China engages in global governance. He's mainly concentrating on fundamental research in world politics with a broad interest in intellectual history, knowledge production, and cross-disciplinary research on political science and the humanities. Dr. Lee has also been senior research fellow here at our Faculty of Law and our Center for Comparative and Public Law. He was also visiting scholar at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. Tonight, we are also very fortunate to have distinguished guest, Professor Daniel Bell, to join us and share his comments on the book. I think many of you know Professor Bell and his work well. He's an internationally established expert on Chinese politics and philosophy, as well as comparative political theory. He's currently the Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University in Qingdao in China. Professor Bell was originally from Canada, but he has lived and taught in China for many years. He's held teaching places in the most prominent universities in Singapore, Shanghai, Beijing, as well as Hong Kong here. He has held research fellowship at Princeton, Stanford, Hebrew University. He's published numerous articles and books on China. The best known book perhaps being The China Model, Political Meritocracy, and the Limits of Democracy. So before we begin this discussion, I'll just introduce some housekeeping matters. We'll begin by having Dr. Lee giving us a 30-minute overview of the book. After that, Professor Bell will comment for around 5 to 10 minutes. Dr. Lee will then be given an opportunity to respond and engage with the discussion. Finally, we'll invite the audience for questions and comments. You can type in the chat box at any time during the discussion. I would pick out questions or main things emerging in the chat. We value comments and contribution from all of our audience. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Dr. Lee now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zhu. Good evening, everyone. It's really an honor and pleasure to have all of you here tonight in my book talk. I'm Walter Lee, the author of the book. This book actually was published in December last year. And at that time, I guess many of us, I guess most of us, including me, myself, didn't really expect what will actually happen this year, say, for example, in Ukraine. And recently, quite a lot of my friends who actually know I have published this book, they are very interested to ask me the question. So what kind of solution you are going to give, to the crisis now in Ukraine? And of course, very challenging question, right? And but I would actually say that for my book here, I'm actually trying to give the readers some different perspectives derived from classical China to look at human conflicts, rather than to offer something like an empirical solution to a particular, say, military conflicts there. So I would actually say the main purpose of writing this book is actually to inspire, to invite questions and more ideas, the imagination about what we can actually have in a reformed or even new security and development architecture for our world in the future. And of course, we know that when we are talking about conflict, right, the word conflict is actually there in the title. We are not only confining our understanding of conflicts to military conflicts. Nowadays, conflicts can take many different forms, right? And in the study of international relations, we know basically we have what we call traditional security, which is related to military matters, and we also have non-traditional security. And in that area, of course, we have conflicts, well, can be almost in all aspects. You know, say for example, in the past few years, trade war between China and the US, cyber war, right, legal warfare. We can also have the war, you know, that kind of competition and rivalry in terms of knowledge production as well. So my view on conflicts is that conflicts always exist, and I would actually think that it's quite impossible to get rid of conflicts. It's actually part of the nature of the human society. But the thing we can actually do is to minimize the negative impact of that and to minimize the opportunity of having conflicts there. So let me begin with something related to the core ideas of this book, because I've actually included a lot of things here, honestly, and it's actually a cross-disciplinary study. Basically, because I'm actually a scholar in international relations, so of course there would be analysis from the perspective of international politics, but you can also find something related to international law and comparative philosophy and history as well. So I would actually just like to highlight that this book actually stresses on the use of the classical texts, and to see how the application of the ideas in, say, for example, especially the Chinese classics, right? Because that's actually the case in this book. How the application of the Chinese classics can inform some new ideas about the reform in knowledge production in international relations and international law. By examining how the classical Chinese thought looks at conflicts, by assessing how possible it is for classical Chinese thoughts to have a dialogue with the liberal Western norms of just war, liberalism, and cosmopolitanism, we may then have an idea what classical Chinese resources can contribute to the reform of today's global security and development architecture. And China's case may provide a template for other civilizations and cultures to do the same. So I'm actually using the Chinese case well because that's actually the case I'm most familiar with because I speak the Chinese language, I can read the Chinese language, and in my past education, I also did study in Chinese history and literature, those things as well. So I should begin with this. But it doesn't mean that China is the only case. I mean, the methodology I've actually used here in this book can also be something, I guess, to be referenced by scholars in some other, especially non-Western civilizations. Say, if some scholars would like to do the same for the Indian civilization or for the Persian civilization, Islamic civilization, they can do the same. And I would actually argue that this is exactly something we need to do in the future to democratize the knowledge production in international relations theory as well as in the knowledge generation in international law. So we need that for a negotiated and reinvented cosmopolitanism and common conscience, which is essential for the remaking of a truly democratic international rule of law in the world. And this book, it is not only a book on conflict, okay? So don't be just tricked by the title there. There's a word conflict that many people just, nowadays we just focus on that because what's going on, say for example in Ukraine. It's not just about that. I'm actually using military intervention, especially the case relating to, say, humanitarian intervention, the responsibility to protect, the just war theories, as a case to question if a set of reformed or even new principles and laws in world politics is possible or not. You may actually ask, so if you are actually focusing on the discovery of some principles and laws in international politics and laws, then why would you actually focus on conflicts? Now, the reason is because my observation is that the laws of war are always as the core of public international law, and the discussion of global constitution is actually in the history we actually know, both in Europe and also in China. And public international law and global constitution actually begin to a large extent with the laws of war. So say, for example, we actually have a sentence in the Zhuozuan, the Chronicle of Zhuo, which is one of the most famous history books in Chinese history. It actually says the great affairs of a state are ritual sacrifice and warfare. That means what? That means now, back at that time, back more than 2,000 years ago, when we are talking about the ritual sacrifice, something related to rights, that actually has to do with what nowadays, what we call the rules and regulations, that means the law. And it's actually the laws and the warfare, these are actually the two very important things there. So, and also I actually quote from a very famous international law expert back in the 20th century, Lauterpacht. So he actually argues that if international law is in some ways as the vanishing point of law, the law of war is perhaps even more conspicuously as the vanishing point of international law. So it's a kind of comparison between international law in general on the one hand, and on the other hand, the law of war. But you actually see that Lauterpacht, he actually, of course, he believes that the law of war is actually occupying a quite important position in the study of international law. So the main purpose of this book is to offer innovation and imagination for future development of Chinese international relations theory and international law, rather than to offer a so-called scientific answer or policy solution. Nowadays, we are living in quite lots of crises in the world. There are many people who are suffering, and it looks like the world, well, on the one hand, the world looks like it's still progressing, with the material life we are enjoying, with the technological advancement we have in the world. This is one aspect, but on the other hand, the world is also increasingly unpredictable and fragmented. So I guess for a lot of us, we actually have this very mixed feeling. Are we actually really living in a safe and secured world? Well, depends on whether you are more optimistic or pessimistic. Some people would say yes and no, and also depends on your social and personal situation, where you are. My opinion is that the current international system of politics and law is apparently not able to solve our crisis. Worse still, it is part of the origin of such a crisis, because it is to a large extent undemocratic and outdated. You may say that, well, we do have principles and laws. Look at the United Nations, right? Look at the Charter of the UN. look at all the international treaties and customs. We have a lot of, different sets of international legal norms and values, the protection of human rights, international humanitarian laws, the Geneva Conventions, and we have a lot of these things there. Well, yes, we have them. But it is the disagreement on the understanding and interpretation of all these rules and institutions which leads to the violation of the rules and principles. And that actually also leads us to more conflicts and disorder. Now, the most obvious thing, I guess, we can observe is nowadays we have at least two versions of international rule of law. One is actually the liberal Western's argument on the rule-based international order. Of course, we also know that's actually the liberal international order, a lot of discussion on that already. And on the Russian side, or even on the Chinese side, you actually see another kind of interpretation, the international law based on the Yalta system, the focus on state sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference. So this can also be a righteous, legitimate interpretation of international rule of law as well. So which is actually more correct, okay? Which is right? So it's actually this kind of, it's a matter of hermeneutics, interpretation that which brings us quite a lot of problems there. So my opinion is that we need to sit down and have an honest talk, at least for us, the academics, right? I'm not sure about the politicians, but for scholars, that's actually something we can do, to sit down and have an honest talk and to comprehensively review our current values and norms and rules, institutional settings. And we need an updated system made by and made for all nations and all people on earth. Therefore, we have a very challenging question in front of us. Are there any truly long-lasting principles and laws in world politics and international law, which can be commonly recognized, respected, and practiced by all nations and even by conflicting nations on earth? Now, I dare not use the word eternal, okay? I'll actually just say that, well, long-lasting principles and laws. For I actually understand that the people doing international politics and laws, we are not really the scholars in natural science, okay? We are not mathematicians. We are not doing physics or mathematics or astronomy. The kind of principles and laws in natural science may not be exactly the same as the kind of principles and laws we are looking after. And we are actually seeking, in the study of the human society. So I just used the word, okay, long-lasting principles and laws there. And so for me, of course, I realized that, we have the crisis there in the real world nowadays, but I can also see the opportunity. So I actually just did some research and actually write this book and have a try to see if some preliminary work on, suggesting a set of common principles and laws in world politics could be possible or not. As the Chinese word Wei Ji, Nai Gei tells, it's actually made up of two Chinese characters. So Wei, that means danger, and the Ji means opportunity, right? So in front of the crisis, we do have the danger, but we also do have the opportunity to do something. So talking about the so-called principles and laws, let me show you a photo. If you guys can see that.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. So this photo was taken in a place called Ariha in Syria back 2 years ago in 2020. And the photo was actually taken by a photojournalist called Omar Hash Kador. He's actually a photojournalist of the AFP. And when I noticed this photo, when I discovered this photo, my book was already on on its way for printing, so it's like actually too late. Originally, I would really like to include it in my book, or at least, well, somewhere in my book. I think it's actually quite meaningful because I think it actually tells us something about at least my feeling, as the author of this book. There is a saying called, even wars have rules, right? I guess a lot of us have heard about that statement. Widely recognized statement told by the International Committee of the Red Cross and also in the international humanitarian law. So in terms of the meaning, of course, it's so right. Of course, we know. Most of us will support it, of course, right? But how about in reality? What actually happened? Now, what you can actually see here is actually a place that is so war-torn, right? So a half-collapsed building. And before that, of course, we would imagine that there must be a very heavy fighting in this place. And it is at night, and you actually see that on the ground. You actually see all these rubbles, ruins, right? And in a sharp contrast with the backdrop, you have the skies, right? All the stars there, like a Milky Way, is actually there. That's actually a sharp contrast. And you also have a man probably lighting a cigarette. And to me, it looks like he's actually pondering, thinking about something, like a philosopher. And I think it actually symbolizes the status of human. The human is actually always in between the very messy and violent, animalistic world on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the rational, virtuous heaven. And what we need to do is to realize our humanistic spirit, is to struggle to work towards the goal in heaven. Okay, although we may never truly get there, but the effort should be made. So when you look at the sky, of course, you may actually think about, maybe this is actually something related to natural science, So principles and laws, they are so common to be found in, say, as I said before, mathematics, physics, astronomy. But how about the human world, right? This is actually something which the moral philosophers, international legal theorists, and IELTS theorists should think about. So our case here is actually China, and more precisely, Chinese IELTS theory innovation. So what can China contribute in the projects of seeking common principles and laws? And I would actually say this is not something totally new. Okay, I'm not actually the first person, of course. So I'm not the first person to dig into this, to study this. Let me just quote from a very famous Chinese international law scholar and also the judge, Wang Keya. A lot of you may actually heard about him. So he actually said that the restructuring of international society leads to this transformation of international law, which ceases to be a European public law and has become a law of universal application. The differences of historical and cultural heritages, well accommodated, can yield even more fruitful results. The goal is to establish an effective universal international law. The task of international lawyers is to take account of different histories and cultures of various countries and to find out principles of law and justice which are common to all. So this was actually, I'm not sure if it was written back in 1990, but it was actually found in a book published back in 1990. So at least more than 30 years ago, right? So you actually have scholars already talking something related to that. So my approach here in this book would actually be something similar. And I actually coined my approach as, well, with the name Lawless Archaeology of Chinese International Relations. Again, this is not just something new. I'm actually, say, for example, if you read chapter 3 in my book, you actually know that I've actually done a kind of summary of what actually happened in the past few decades in the field of international relations. we already have a lot of scholars there using classical Chinese resources to inform us some new knowledge in international relations. Say, for example, the scholars at Tsinghua University, under the leadership of Professor Yan Shuetong, a lot of you know that. And we also have other scholars in Fudan University. And outside China, we also have scholars in the US, in the British Commonwealth countries, in continental Europe. You have different schools of scholars doing similar works, focusing on Chinese history, classical Chinese history, philosophy. Some of them, if they know how to read the classical Chinese language, they just go and read directly, the Chinese classical text and try to get something from it. And you already have different schools there focusing on the classics. What I have done in my book is to add something to that. I would actually argue that we need the collaboration among scholars from different disciplines. So it's not just the IL scholars, not just the Chinese IL scholars, but the Chinese IL scholars, they have to talk to the scholars in international law. Say, for example, those especially, having an expertise in the Chinese approach to public international law, and also talk to philosophers, especially people doing research in comparative philosophy, historians, all these people, they should actually get involved. My observation till the time just before the COVID, because after COVID, then I actually haven't got much opportunity to join conferences, but just before the COVID, till that time, my observation is that scholars of different academic disciplines, they are largely still talking to their own friends, their own colleagues there. And I think it would actually be a good thing if, scholars from different areas can get together and have a conversation and dialogue. And the second thing is that on top of using the classics, we actually have to pay attention to the method of interpretation. So if you are just talking about the use of classics alone for the use of innovation in Chinese IR theory, it's not enough, because how we read those words actually matters a lot. So my approach in this book would be, I'm trying to use a cosmopolitan vision of world politics and law, and I have to acknowledge that, I have to be honest that I have a particular concern about what China can do in international ethics and global justice. So that would actually be my approach, So earlier I actually said that the case I'm using is a Chinese case, and it's actually also the case of humanitarian intervention and R2B. So to just give you all a very general overview of what I have done, I would like to just show you this figure. So the case I have used in this book would actually be China's approach to humanitarian intervention and R2B. So of course we know that the official position nowadays for China would be non-interventionism. And if you compare that to the Western approach to intervention, usually we call it liberal internationalism. Of course, you have a huge gap there, okay, what we call the conceptual divergence. So is there a way to bridge the two to see if the Chinese approach to humanitarian intervention and R2B can actually have a constructive dialogue with the liberal Western discourse there? So what I've done is actually to look into some of the classical texts and look for the elements of user bellum, so that's actually part of the just war doctrine or the just war theory in China. And I've actually discovered something which can be compared to nowadays Chinese position on non-interventionism. But there are also something which is very different. It can be very different. So you actually have the comparison between these two, and then you also have the comparison between the classical ideas and nowadays liberal Western ideas. And you actually find something, of course, something different, but there also something in parallel, something quite like each other as well. So it's actually by using the comparative method, then we may actually derive a more, to get a more useful, constructive outcome to see if we can actually get something useful from classical China and to be applied to nowadays Chinese foreign policy or the Chinese international relations, to use it as a dialogue with the Western world and see if we can actually break the deadlock of the disagreement between the two. So, so the classical texts I have used there, almost all of them, they're actually from the pre-Qin era. So that means those texts from the spring and autumn period and the Warring State period, say, for example, the Chronicle of Zhuo, the Nin Suo Zhuan, and Mencius Xunzi, and also some other schools. And in particular, I would actually say that there are also three classics which are also very important. And for these three classics, actually in history, you already have scholars who paid attention to them since very early time. Okay, so the first one is the Spring and Autumn Annuals, and the second one would be the Rise of Zhou, and the third one will be the Book of Rice. So that means in Chinese 春秋周礼跟这个礼记. So these three. So you actually see that from very early time till the late Qing periods, with William A.P. Martin, and also the 100 Days reformers like Kang Youwei, Tan Sitong, Liang Jicao, and all the way till the early Republican periods, with the Chinese diplomats, of the nationalist party side, say for example, very famously, Wellington Koo, they have all written something on the use of these classical texts. Why would they do so? Because that's a way for them to understand the world, understand what's actually happening, with all this warfare, diplomacy, balance of power, and especially, I guess, if you are just focusing on the late Qing period all the way to the early 20th century, because that was a time when China was actually under foreign aggression and a lot of civil unrest as well. So, and that's exactly the time when China was actually just shocked and wake up, and trying to understand, so, okay, what's this world about? What does it mean by international law or sovereignty or nationalism, like all these concepts, right? So in order to understand all these Western, or you can say international conceptions, then one way to do it is to dig into, your own tradition, to find something similar in your own tradition and to compare that to those new things so that you can understand what all these new concepts are about. And that's exactly, say, for example, what William Martin, he has done, in order to make the Qing dynasty officials understand what, say, for example, state sovereignty is about, and he actually make use of those classical texts, And in this book, I'm actually, I've actually tried to follow this trend, but the different thing I have done is actually to, just like what I've said, I have actually used a new method there. So cosmopolitanism, we invented cosmopolitanism. So part of the reason is that because I have already observed that there are a lot of scholars nowadays, especially Chinese IELTS scholars, they have applied the ideas they have got from the Chinese classics and applied that to nowadays study of international relations. But it's actually really sure whether, say, foreign audiences, they can really understand all this, And since I'm actually interested in cosmopolitanism, then it would actually be even a more important question, because if you really truly want to be cosmopolitan and to tell people in other countries or other governments that, okay, this is actually something good for us, then you have to convince those people, right? You have to not just say that, okay, this is actually originally from the Chinese tradition, but you have to show that, okay, this is something you can understand. This is something that you can also find it in your own tradition. So, so my focus would be more on, if you want to practice this kind of cosmopolitan interpretation, interpretive methods, then you have to really have a sense of empathy there, for the audiences in all these different countries. So for the methods I have applied, mainly there are actually two things. One is actually the reinterpretation of the Chinese tradition. So I just mentioned that I'm actually focusing on the Chinese cosmopolitan interpretation of all these texts. So what I call the emancipative hermeneutics is more favorable, than what I call the fundamentalist hermeneutics in interpreting the Chinese tradition. So that the rediscovered ideas from the Chinese classics can be usable by IL scholars and the international legal scholars. And the second thing would be, the second aspect of the methods I use would be comparative studies. So this would actually be very important for us to seek common grounds and to respect the differences. And there are actually two dimensions. One is actually comparative international political theory. And for that one, I actually applied some previous studies in comparative literature as well. And that's actually one part. And for the other part would be what I call comparative jurisprudence. And that would actually be a reflection on the study of public international law and also comparative law. And I've actually found that it's actually easier for the comparative law scholars to talk about a comparative study in international law, rather than for the scholars in international law to talk about something related to comparative law. So I guess, sooner or later in the future, we actually have to get this problem solved, even in the area of international law, then it's possible for us to compare different traditions, the legal traditions from different countries. It shouldn't actually be something like an area being just dominated by the Western tradition. So cross-cultural and cross-civilisational study would be essential for us to find a common conscience, okay, and the reinvented cosmopolitan ideas there. And so this is actually the part on finding out the ideas, okay, the responsibilities and the jobs and the tasks for the scholars. And in terms of practice, I just have one just imagination there, okay, just one suggestion. What I call the post-liberal emancipated Leviathan. I'm not actually saying that I'm essentially a realist, but I'm actually borrowing the idea from Thomas Hobbes and probably a little bit from Professor G. John Eikenberry as well, because both of them, they actually made use of the term Leviathan there. I actually refer to all possible types of authority, political authority, for the protection of what we will get from the cross-civilisational and cross-cultural negotiation there, because for a lot of the idealistic ideas in the world, the values there, we can always talk at the academia, of course, right? But for a lot of the time, those are actually just talks. If you really want to make a change in the world, then you need to practice. And immediately you actually think about, so is there actually an authority which can understand all those intellectual exercises we'll actually be doing, the outcomes, and to support them and to protect them, right? And such an authority, I'm not necessarily just referring to a sovereign state. Okay, so it's not just necessarily like I guess some people will actually ask me, so are you talking about the future China, or are you actually having some hope for the future America or Europe as a whole or something like that? Well, possibly, or if you can also think about, say, a reformed United Nations can also be that kind of authority as well. So I actually have this idea on top of some other scholars' ideas. Say, for example, Professor Fred Darmier's post-liberalism idea, Professor Yan Xuetong's idea of humane authority, Professor Anthony Carty and Professor Jan Nijman's idea of moral and responsible ruler. Okay, so on top of that, I actually have this idea. So just very quickly, what should be done next? So I've actually just, in this book, make use of the Chinese case, the classical Chinese case. And I think this is just the beginning. The search of common principles and laws can also be done with, in some other areas. For example, in the last chapter, in chapter 8, I actually suggest that we should actually focus on classical education, on aesthetic education, the more understanding of the natural world, the mother nature, okay, etc. All these things. So the search for the common principles and laws, this would actually be a giant project, which involves not only China, but also the West, also the rest as well. So, and as I have said, it involves not only the IELTS scholars, but also scholars in other disciplines, like in history, philosophy, law, right? And is Chinese cosmopolitanism possible? Can we actually summarize and unify all the relevant discussions and conceptions? We already have some conceptions related to cosmopolitanism, already in the Chinese discussion. Say, for example, the idea of 天下, 大同, Liang Zhi, or the philosopher Mozi, his idea of 兼爱. Or in Buddhism, you have the idea of 众生平等. These are all very useful ideas, but sort of fragmented. How can you actually summarize them and make a useful theory? That would actually be something we have to do. And so what I have done in this book is the first step of a marathon, I would actually say. And what I want to do is just to invite you, the readers, to think about the possibility of a shift in our global political and legal imagination, so a reformed or a new architecture of international peace and security can be possible, so that we can walk away from a lot of our current crisis. So hopefully I have not only given you a glimpse into this book, but also trigger some questions in your mind. So you will be interested in reading what I have written in it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. It's a very informative overview of the book. Now I'll invite Professor Bell to give his comments.
So thank you, Professor Lee. Let me first say what I admired about this book. It was extremely erudite and wide-ranging and inspiring at times. And it's impossible not to learn something. The book draws not just on classical Chinese perspectives, but many other traditions to make its points. What I learned most, let me also say that the translations were generally quite readable, very good. What I learned most was about the 左传 as a potential source for just war thinking. I'll come back to that later. But there's also little, fascinating tidbits here and there. For example, why did the state of Qin achieve victory and unified China? And Professor Lee says persuasively one important reason is that they were the most open to migration from other states at the time. I think it's a very interesting point. I'm not sure if historians would agree with that, but at least it's interesting to me. But now let me wear my critical hat and to say what perhaps might be questionable about the book. And I think its main advantage, which is its ambition, is also its main drawback. And I think there's basically two books here. And the first book I found not very persuasive. But the second book I thought was much more persuasive and focused, although there's still questions, and I'll end with those questions. And let me first say the first book that I found not very persuasive, and this is the most ambitious book, and it's the one that Professor Lee spent most time on now. It's saying that we need to have common principles and laws that would help us to, if not solve, then at least minimize global conflicts, including climate change, things like excessive selfishness and individualism that are often condemned in the book. And for that, we need some sort of virtuous state that with the capacity and willingness to deal with global conflicts. And in the book, it's mainly focuses on US and China as examples. In the talk, Reformed UN, fine. The term that's used is emancipated Leviathan. I'm not sure about that terminology, but I think that it's very idealistic, and there's no clear kind of idea of how to get there, how to reform, China or the US or UN, so that it becomes this kind of enlightened global state with the willingness and capacity to solve global problems. I mean, Professor Lee often condemns communism, condemns capitalism. It just seems very utopian, and he criticizes Zhao Tingyang for utopianism. But I think this first book has the same problem. I mean, to be fair, there is some idea for how to get there, and one is that we need this global consensus on values, on principles, and common norms to achieve this kind of cosmopolitan ideas, which would then inform enlightened rulers and without inform the policies of enlightened states. Now, how do we get to these common global values? Well, two things. One, we have to do this, as he mentioned in the talk, this kind of intercultural dialogues that involve not just lawyers, but historians and scholars and philosophers and different scholars. And that's going to lead to these kind of common norms and principles that people are just honest and focused on exchanging the best of their traditions, I guess. Now, I'm very skeptical. I was involved in some of those dialogues, actually, when I was at Hong Kong U many years ago, in the late 90s. There was lots of dialogues how to improve the Universal Declaration of Human Rights so that it's more inclusive of diverse traditions. UNESCO had many dialogues of how to have a kind of global consensus on values. And basically, the more voices you have, the more diverse disciplines and diverse groups of society and different people from different countries, the more difficult it is to achieve a consensus on anything except these empty platitudes, like we should all be moral and avoid harm. But as soon as it comes to dealing with actual issues, then it turns out there's lots of conflict because people rank and prioritize values differently. And even sincere people, not just those who want to use excuses to like hide human rights abuses, but it's basically impossible to lead to this kind of consensus, this unforced consensus, Charles Taylor put it. And many of these dialogues have been dropped now. I mean, even like Du Weiming, who I admire very much, I mean, he's been involved in these dialogues for decades, but he still always asks the same question. So what's the result? He says, we're still talking. Actually, even now people stop talking about it because they realize that it's pretty useless, to be frank, a kind of waste of resources. I don't mean to be too kind of cynical or negative, but I'm just describing what has happened. Another solution, though, to achieve this kind of common conscience, which will underpin these global, this kind of common principles and laws, and it's repeated inside the book quite a few times. Look inside, look what's inside you, and you'll find the same conscience that Mencius mentioned that we have, or that Buddhist mentioned that we have. I don't think that's very helpful either. I mean, I just look at myself when I look inside. What do I see? I just see a vast emptiness. I don't see anything there that could help to solve global problems. It's only when I look outside and I see my social relations and I see things that are meaningful. Maybe it's between a Buddhist and a Confucian. So again, I hope that I'm wrong, but the strategies that are mentioned to reach this kind of common norms and laws and principles that will help us to solve or minimize global problems, and the strategies that are mentioned, intercultural dialogue and looking inside, I mean, I just don't think that's very helpful, to be frank. what we learn from these inter-civilizational dialogues, as sometimes we call them, is that it's much more productive to focus on particular problems. And then it leads to some solutions, you know, how to reduce corruption. Is there kind of global consensus? And this is where it leads me to what I think is the second book, and much more focused book that I like much more in Professor Lee's book. And this is the book it's the middle part of the book, chapters 4 and 5, and it's much more focused on a particular problem, which is thinking about just war and humanitarian intervention, and what can Chinese traditions contribute to that. And I think this is where I think was quite fascinating. And as mentioned, especially the idea that the Zhuozhuan has a lot to contribute, because many of the debates have involved looking at Mengzi, at Mencius, or at Xunzi, or other more sources. But actually, Professor Lee, I think, persuasively shows that the Zhuozhuan has a lot of potential to help us think more productively about these issues of morally justified warfare and humanitarian intervention. You know, on page 234, there's a list of, you know, when force could be justified. I'm not sure that some of the prescriptions are actually persuasive. Like one of the points is that when it helps to facilitate economic development, that's in the Zhuozhuan, but that obviously wouldn't be, you know, a good reason today. So it's still too vague, and I think there's too many excerpts and too brief analysis. I wish that Professor Lee would have fewer excerpts and more analysis, and to tell us in much more detail about, for example, what the Zhuozhuan can tell us about the conditions for example, for humanitarian intervention in modern societies, and how that could improve the way that we think about these issues today. So I'm going to end with two very particular or focused questions for Professor Lee. And the first is the responsibility to protect. I mean, actually, China, after initially showing a lot of doubts about it, has more or less endorsed this principle now. So it's not just a kind of a Western idea, and China doesn't stick to this kind of non-interventionism. I mean, in fact, we see now that they're paying very lip service to it in the case of not condemning this Russian invasion of Ukraine. But so I just don't see exactly what what Professor Lee objects to R2P. What's wrong with it, and how can drawing on that Zhuozhuan and other sources from classical China, especially the pre-Qin period, help us to improve the responsibility to protect ideas? I mean, that's my question. It's not addressed explicitly in the book, but I wish that. I think it's a very interesting topic. Another question that I have, and it's more because I worked on this topic myself. I mean, how exactly would drawing on other sources than Mengzi, for example, the Zhuozhuan, how could that enrich our thinking of humanitarian intervention? I mean, I think Mengzi Mencius has a very rich theory about humanitarian intervention. Well, more about morally justified war more generally. You know, he argues that if states are invaded by other states in an unjust way, then they could legitimately defend themselves. And he also has some conditions for what he calls zheng, you know, punitive expeditions. There are certain conditions in place, right? The kind of liberating power has to be greeted by the people. The greeting has to be long lasting. There has to be some sort of international legitimacy. And the conditions are very clear. It's only in order to justify mass killing. You can't do it to promote democracy, for example. So I think it's a pretty good theory, but how exactly would a richer theory of informed by classical Chinese sources, such as the Zhuozhuan, how could that improve upon Mengzi's theory? I wish that Professor Lee could answer that. I mean, I think drawing on Xunzi has an obvious advantage because he goes into much more detail in the conditions of just and unjust war in warfare, you know, justice in warfare, which Mengzi more or less neglects. Maybe he's too idealistic in this respect. Zhuozhuan seems to have some ideas in that respect as well. So these are my two questions that I would like to end my comment with. And thank you again for the opportunity to comment on this book. And again, it's really a rich source of thinking. And even if we don't have to agree with what I call this first book, overly ambitious first book, but there's so many fascinating aspects to the book that are worth learning from. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bale, for these very thought-provoking comments. So, Dr. Lee, would you like to respond before we open the floor to our audience, particularly respond to the two questions Professor Bale just asked?
Okay, sure. Thank you very much, Professor Bell, for your very incisive comment. And I do agree to a lot of your observations there. It looks like there are actually two books in one book. And, you know, your comments on I'm actually could be really too ambitious or even too utopian. I think I actually have that problem as well, but this is exactly, you know, I guess the nature of the idea of cosmopolitanism. You always have the aspects of, you know, getting very idealistic there. So, and it also looks like, you know, there are actually too many talks just on the ideas, on the very abstract concepts, but not enough of the practice or the actual cases to be used. I would actually say that perhaps one solution there is even within the discussion in the academia, apart from letting everyone to speak up, you know, to have a different voices there, just like what you said about your experience, say at Hong Kong U before, right? The you know, different scholars, they have different opinions, and it can actually get quite messy. You do need some leadership there as well. So I'm not sure it is actually correct to say whether this is also a kind of political issue. But, you know, in any kind of discussion, of course, you actually have different voices and you do have some leading voices there. So perhaps that's actually one of the ways to be more possible to reach a consensus. And let me see. And you actually said that it's actually better to focus on the actual problems. I agree. And but I would actually say that perhaps would be my future projects, you know, to focus on some more, different global issues by using the classical Chinese wisdoms I actually discover in the future. And to be honest, some years ago, when I was finishing my doctoral degree, then one scholar, you know, at that time, he actually suggests to me that, well, probably you can actually make use of your ideas to publish a textbook in the future. You know, the kind of, I'm still having this in my mind, you know, a kind of textbook that with all the cases, you know, with all the cases, say like refugee problem or climate change, or, you know, inequality, you know, based on all the problems we have nowadays in the world, and then to see what kind of ideas from the classical Chinese text can be applied. So, not sure about how you think about it, but that's actually something I have in my mind.
Very good idea.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So, yeah. Maybe in the future when I have some new developments in this project, I'll let you know. Yeah. So yes, and for your questions, for the first one, for the R2P question, I actually think that now in my book, one problem there is because I began with this project quite early. So I guess, say, for example, part of the discussions there, say, especially those with humanitarian intervention and R2P, could actually be, I've actually tried my best to update what actually happened in the past few years. But probably in terms of the arguments there, it may still sound a little bit old. So say, for example, like back 5 years ago, I was actually still having this idea that, well, the Chinese official position to humanitarian intervention and R2P would be actually quite, you know, not accepting, you know, those ideas. But then, of course, we know that even for the Chinese scholars, say like Wang Zhongze, you know, he actually has another idea called responsible protection, which can actually be seen as a kind of refined version of the R2P by using the Chinese ideas. And nowadays, of course, it's quite clear to us that I guess even for the Chinese government is, I mean, for the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 within the R2P, they're actually quite agreeable. The problem is actually with Pillar 3. You know, they really when and under what circumstances you can actually use military force. So I would actually say that nowadays Chinese position is not totally objecting R2P, but if I've actually expressed myself not very clearly in the book, so I guess forgive me. That's actually something I can say. And for your second question, I've actually also noticed that, you know, for Mencius and Xunzi, you know, these two books, they're actually easier for us to use in the sense that because they not only have the stories there, but also have the comments, you know, on the moral judgment on what actually happened in those stories. So it's actually easier for us to use. But for Zuo Zhuan, because it's a historical text, and what I find useful or interesting is that from the perspective of international relations, the stories it actually also tells us something about the basic elements in international relations. Say, for example, if you use Hallie Booth's understanding of international politics, you know, the balance of power, diplomacy, wars, international laws, you know, those elements are all in there. And for some of the previous writings, including those early in the 20th century, you know, on the use of pre-Qin history for the study of international politics. Some scholars, they also use Zuo Zhuan. And to my best knowledge, those are mainly historians. Some of them, they're historians also doing international relations. So, so I just find some of the stories, you know, being told by Zuo Zhuan there, they can actually, I mean, you can actually find some elements of international relations there. So as it can actually be used as a good text for comparison, and including those scholars, you know, well, historians as well as international relations scholars, when they are debating about whether there were something like sovereign states in the pre-Qin era. Some of them, they also use this text. So that's why I actually use that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So now we will open the floor to our audience. Now I already have a question from Larry. So the question is about Ukraine. The question is that regarding the ongoing war in Ukraine, China has been reluctant to address the aggression on sovereignty, but has implicitly quoted some claims made by Russian authorities that might justify the invasion. So do you think it could be a sign of a shift in Chinese interpretation of global order, which has long been based on non-intervention and state sovereignty? In fact, I want to add something to that question. You mentioned the negative international responsibility in your book. So it's kind of like that China has been caught between the non-interventionism policy and also the negative international responsibility. So China is kind of like in the dilemma. So my question is related to this one. Do you think there's any alternative strategy that Chinese government could imply in this crisis?
My observation is, of course, it's possible that the Chinese government is now in a dilemma. But it's also possible that, I guess, China just look at all these things from a rather different perspective. So if we are actually looking at China's response to the Ukraine crisis just by a rather, I guess, black and white mentality, saying that, okay, if you are not condemning Russia, or if you are not saying this is an invasion, then you are actually, you know, violating your own principle or the promises on non-intervention. My feeling is like this would actually be a rather Western way of understanding the whole story. China's understanding of non-intervention state sovereignty, as well as many other concepts in international relations, can be understood in a rather relative position. It actually depends on in which context you actually talk about. So, I'm not sure if say scholars, professors like Xin Yaqing, they are actually doing relationality, that kind of theory. They will actually have this kind of interpretation. But to me, sometimes perhaps it may not be too useful to just use this kind of clear-cut way to understand China's position. It looks like it doesn't really mean that I'm violating my principle of non-intervention. Only when you know that I'm not condemning that particular country making the military action. China is actually not involved. China is actually not the party making the action of military intervention there. So so that would actually be something I can actually think about.
Okay, thank you. Professor Albert Chen, do you have any comments or questions?
Yes, yeah, maybe I have two comments or questions. One is the focus on intervention, including humanitarian intervention and non-intervention. So why, Walter, why are you particularly interested in this particular aspect of international relations? I remember that in the 1990s, when NATO attacked the former Yugoslavia, and engaged in bombing, that was justified on the ground of humanitarian intervention. So was that the background for your research? Because today, I think people are less interested in humanitarian intervention. They are more interested in the case of Ukraine, which is actually a case of aggression rather than humanitarian intervention. I think even Russia or Putin is not saying that they are engaging in humanitarian intervention, even though they mentioned some Nazis in Ukraine, but that is not the principal claim, because humanitarian intervention is about protection of human rights in the country which is being interfered with. So that's the first question. Second is, I know that Daniel has mentioned some of the ideas in the book, such as having a virtuous state, or people looking inside, practicing some kind of self-cultivation or going into one's conscience. So are these the Chinese ideas, the contribution of Chinese philosophy to what we can do today? I mean, what specifically are the substance? What exactly is the substantive contribution of the Chinese classics? Do they contribute some distinctive or particularly valuable insights or values or principles or ideas? So that's my 2 points.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. For your first question, well, I'm actually interested in, generally in how China responds to the ethical issues on the global scale. Say, for example, how China looks at issues of global justice, those things. One reason is that for the study of China in the world, then we already have a lot of discussions, in almost all areas. And when I was a student doing study in Chinese international relations, I just find international ethics and global justice would actually be something like a niche, something like an area that lacks scholars to put in more effort into. Nowadays, when we talk about China and global governance, we actually have a lot of discussions on how China looks as peace and security, the global economic governance, even climate change, or now even the pandemic, public health. A lot of the topics are already there, but then when you're talking about the most tricky, the most controversial issues there in international relations, then my question will be, okay, usually where is China's voice? Sometimes it's not just about the Chinese government, but also from the academia, the intellectual discussion. Say, how would Chinese scholars look at, that's actually the case I use, humanitarian intervention or R2P, So, and these are, of course, some of the most controversial, most challenging areas. So I would actually like to have a look at that. And the time I actually began looking at these things were already more than 10 years ago. And of course, we know the world has changed now. Say back in the early 2000s or even close to 2010, 2012 and 13, we still have quite a lot of publications and discussions on humanitarian intervention. Of course, largely based on the liberal understanding. It's actually the whole discourse about humanitarian intervention is actually built on the liberal Western understanding of the protection of human rights and how to do justice, especially international criminal justice. But now with the war in Ukraine, then we'll see if there will be a change, a transformation in our understanding of the use of force. It looks like we're actually going back to a time when we focus more on just on military intervention and the traditional wars, conventional wars. And I personally would doubt whether, in the future, at least in the near future, we will still have more discussion on humanitarian intervention, because this has to do with the power of the liberal West, especially the leadership of the US. In the past, of course, when the US was strong, say back in the 1990s, the early 2000s, you had the case in former Yugoslavia, you have Iraq, you have Afghanistan, Libya, like those cases, when the US was still the leader. You can actually afford to fight wars in different places in the world. And it was actually so much involved in NATO and in terms of intellectual, the ideological world, in the Western world, the liberal ideas was actually, the prominence, the leading idea there. And after Donald Trump, the whole world's totally different. And I've actually heard from the news that say, if Donald Trump's coming back, in 2024, for the next presidency in the US, then it's possible that he's going to withdraw from the NATO. So you have a lot of very different, nowadays it's so unpredictable, and that's why I'm actually quite doubtful about whether there could still be the space for us to further discuss about the idea of humanitarian intervention. Or maybe we actually just shift to talk about in general, military intervention. And for your second question, for the actual contribution of given by the Chinese classics, I think, we have many different types of Chinese classics. And I think in a summary, I would actually think that it's the way of thinking. It's actually the mentality that we actually can learn from these classics. They can actually be quite different from the Western ones. And say, for example, it will not be something like, with this Western mentality of, always seeing things in dichotomy. a whole practice from, say, from Aristotle all the way to Hegel and Marx, as well, this necessary struggle, the conflict between the two sides, the binary struggle there. In the Chinese tradition, of course, you also have, say, for example, yin and yang, like these, the two sides interacting with each other, but then not necessarily to be the enemy of each other or in conflict with each other. It's actually in a situation of nurturing each other, producing something new. So I think this is just one example. I think it's actually the mentality, the way of thinking, which is different, and of course this has to do with the Chinese people's worldview, how they look at the world. And it has a lot to do with the lifestyle, the environments they live in. The very early Chinese people, the continental, agricultural society there. So that's, I guess, something I can offer.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee, for this very inspiring discussion. I think we are running out of time, so I think this is the end of this event. Dr. Lee, would you like to show the cover of the book to our audience?
Thanks for reminding me. So everyone, so this is actually a page created by the publisher. So if you're interested in buying this book, then you can actually use this promo code, and you actually get 20% off of the price of this book, and it is valid until the 1st of June. So still have more than 1 month to go. And this is the QR code here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee, Professor Bell, and Professor Chen for this discussion. And thank everyone for being here tonight. Welcome to join the future events hosted by the Center for Comparative and Public Law of Hong Kong U in the future. So have a good night or have a good day. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.